tomorrow. We found them clearing out their offices with no great sense of urgency and burning documents that they don't want to leave behind. Major Ben Farrell of the British Army is handling the removal of the armed police, the so-called MUP, which was the iron and blood-stained hand of the Yugoslav government in Kosovo. But today, the MUP colonel greeting him was charm itself, as his interpreter handed Major Farrell a key to the office he will now occupy at police headquarters, where a small number of Serb policemen will be allowed to stay after tomorrow's deadline.
This is no more surprises, and NATO insists its Kosovo operation is hardly being disrupted by the presence of a mere 200 to 300 Russian soldiers in Pristina. The fact that the Russian troops remain in position today, deciding who does and who doesn't get to use the key road to the airport, is undoubtedly an embarrassment and a worrying portent of the future if NATO and Moscow fail to agree to a unified command structure. President Clinton's larger deployment of the Peace Force, the first American troops have now entered the province. More than 1,000 Marines greeted by ethnic Albanians as they cross the border from Macedonia on their way to the southeast of Kosovo, which will become the US sector. Paul Davis.
Forces today, I can tell you, it's firmly in the hands of the US Army's 82nd Airborne Brigade out of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. They've been tasked with searching each and every one of these refugees to try and make sure no arms go back into Kosovo. I can tell you they say that they've seized at least 2 handguns in the past 24 hours, but nothing any more serious than that.
Incredibly, the French tried, the Italians tried, the British tried. But the Russians, despite the fact that they're a small force of only 200, and the Russian foreign minister in Moscow has given assurances that no more would follow them, stubbornly held their ground. Today, NATO says that a temporary forward headquarters is being established to the south of the town, and that the British NATO Commander General Sir Michael Jackson will later meet the newly promoted Russian General Viktor Zavazin in an attempt to integrate their forces. British Army medics took away a Serb who'd been shot in the head. He was believed to be a soldier or policeman travelling in civilian clothes with his colleagues in a car which came under attack. German NATO forces crossing into Kosovo from Albania have been obliged to prevent ethnic Albanian refugees from doing the same, keeping them at bay with barbed wire and a row of soldiers. The Albanians are desperate to return to their homes, but the danger and uncertainties of Kosovo are too great, and they must wait, perhaps for weeks.
Slowly but surely, NATO's armoured advance continues. Everywhere it's the same, wherever you look. Here is the village of Stimje. They hope to rebuild a future from a shattered past.
Was a man with a gun who was...
Well, he would have come out, started brandishing the pistol, will be warned, and they'll say, stop, please stop, stop, bang. And that's the end of it.
What about giving that warning in other languages, though? I mean, obviously stop's pretty understandable, but...
Well, quite frankly, the warning will be given in as the best language they can, but soldiers don't speak all languages. But quite frankly, they'll also probably be trained in what...
Months of pent-up frustration and anger spilled out as Kosovars watched the long column of paramilitaries leave their town. The civilian
1st U.S. Infantry Division have started to deploy, setting up base camps, and they are really being treated as a liberating army by the ethnic Albanians, some of whom are trickling back and getting courage from the fact that the U.S. troops are in their sector, going home to look at their houses. Many of them have found them really trashed and some destroyed. At the same time, Yugoslav army troops are pulling out. According to the agreement for the phased withdrawal of Yugoslav army troops and Serb forces, they must be out of this particular area by tomorrow. And therefore, we have seen long convoys of armored personnel carriers, some tanks, many army trucks carrying out army personnel and equipment. For the most part, it has gone smoothly. There have been no incidents, according to U.S. troops, just some verbal harassment and some obscene gestures, and indeed a few smiles and waves from some...
Robust peacekeeping was the brief, and that's exactly what faces these KFOR troops for an indefinite period, because the two sides in this conflict are neighbours, and neither must be allowed to get the upper hand. But those are civil matters. The soldiers must just go. Still time for a little extra destruction before they make their angry, defiant, but ignominious withdrawal.
leaving NATO to fill the vacuum. Andrew Wilson, Sky News, in Pristina.
Established to the south of the town, and there will be further meetings today to try to get the forces integrated. And the tense conflict have agreed there should be an intensification of dialogue, especially between military officials, to work on an agreement. And the US and Russian defense ministers are likely to meet this week. The army and some paramilitary police have been reluctant to leave Pristina, but through the day their convoys have been heading out of town. For the NATO troops, and at the border they were obliged to prevent ethnic Albanian refugees from crossing into Kosovo because of the dangers. On the Kosovo and Montenegro border, the problem is with Serb refugees fleeing Kosovo. Over 5,000 have crossed in the past 48 hours. Dale Levac.
The defeat of Prizren's Serbs has been sealed. Prizren's Albanians are glorying in it. Innocent Serbs have suffered enormously since Yugoslavia started breaking up. But not one tear was shed for them by the people who stayed behind in Prizren, who suffered so much themselves at the hands of Serb forces.
This is a disaster for the Serbs and a day of triumph for the Albanians. KFOR's biggest challenge now is controlling the rage and the desire for revenge that both sides have.
Then it was the Serbian military's turn. Some of them tried to get out of town as quickly as possible. Others slowed down to eyeball Albanians one last time. The convoy had hundreds of vehicles, thousands of people. It headed for Serbia through the mountains to avoid Albanian KLA fighters. And back in Prizren, Kosovo Albanians celebrated. They decided to stop singing and dancing when the war with the Serbs started. Now it's over, and as far as they're concerned, they've won. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
As the conviction of German soldiers by firing at a tank were cut down. A hail of bullets heralding the arrival of NATO's new hardline shoot-to-kill policy. The few Serbs who dare to remain have sought sanctuary in a church, some too frail to flee and too scared to go home. As the people of Prizren returned to homes commandeered by the Serbs, they found a terrifying array of weapons and booby traps. It'll take an army of experts to make these homes safe once more.
But reassures them with professional patrolling so they know that they are secure and they know that their future is safe.
The British are thundering around to the outlying villages, covering every dot on the map. In Serb areas there is sullenness. In Albanian the euphoria continues. The Green Howards are heroes to the people of Avalier.
All the Albanian people
are too happy to be seen in their present situation. And late this afternoon, hundreds more Serb soldiers were rolling up to go. Men posing, gesturing, yelling abuse at NATO. Past them went the Green Howards from the Irish Guards battle group to the Serb chagrin heading for the suburb which bears the name treasured in Serb history, Kosovo Polje, in honor of the battle all Serbs glory in 600 years ago. In went the British to find large numbers of the feared special police, much discomforted by their arrival. They too have to leave. Their resentment was plain. They too have reasons not to appear on camera.
The name Kosovo Polje means everything to Serbia. The fact that it is no longer under Serb control and under the eyes of British NATO troops will strike at the heart of every Serb. Kate Adey, BBC News, Kosovo.
From the capital. The looks on the faces of the militia and troops said it all. One more day and it's over. They must be gone. As with this whole three-day-old operation, NATO's takeover was settled agreeably, but that didn't mean the Serbs had to like it. Throughout Pristina and beyond, KFOR's addition to the complicated ethnic mix has raised both anger and adulation, and the situation is still hard to read. In the morning, a Serb sniper proudly displayed his rifle in the center of town, while his comrades observed KFOR's movements from their armored cars. And yet up the road, their comrades were on the move. Even the stronghold at Pristina's airport has started to spew out constant streams of military refugees. But the Serbs from people who just days ago lived in fear of their presence. The reports are coming in of the first internally displaced refugees. Up to 20,000, it's thought, desperate for aid just 10 miles down the road. However swift this operation, it couldn't be fast enough. Andrew Wilson, Sky News in Pristina.
Kosovan town of Gnilana near the Macedonian border. The Serbian civilian was driving the red minibus full of fellow Serbs when he came under attack from ethnic Albanians as he tried to flee the town. Fortunately, a French NATO officer was on the scene and he probably prevented a lynching, but he took a punch from the frightened Serb for his trouble. Finally, the Serb civilian drove the minibus out of town with a smashed windscreen and to the jeers of the Albanian crowd. In Pristina, NATO's standoff with the Russians goes on tonight. All attempts to get the Russians to allow NATO troops past their roadblock and into Pristina's airport have failed.
I'm not in a turf war with them. They are on the airfield. They regard it as important. It is not important to me at this stage.
NATO says that a temporary forward headquarters is being established to the south of the town, and there will be further meetings today to try to get the forces integrated. And the tense confrontation
chokes the roads as it tries to funnel armed force through these narrow passes. All along this route, the Yugoslav army had destroyed Albanian villages, trying to prevent the Kosovo Liberation Army mounting ambushes. But in Chernolevo, Slav soldiers drove through Pristina on their way out. It was another chance for noisy gestures of defiance.
All of the tensions here seem to be mounting as the Serbs get ready to leave this city by tomorrow and the whole of Kosovo by Sunday. If KFOR can hold the ring.
The future on patrol with the Irish Guards tonight, and gunfire sends troops into a house-to-house search. The pessimist view goes something like this: KFOR soldiers being sucked into built-up areas to pursue those still dealing in sectarian violence. In this case, they did not catch the gunman.
I'm not entirely sure whether they're actually shooting at us. I think at the moment there's a number of shootings going on up into the air and at certain people, but nothing particularly aimed. I don't think it's controlled. It seems to be sporadic, and I think we're going to get more of it.
Cliche, Julia, but it's true to say that in this situation, every day does throw up another challenge for KFOR. First and foremost, as we've been hearing, they have to consolidate the huge numbers of troops and equipment that they've moved in just the past 3 days or so. They then have to synchronize with the Serb pull-out, as Mark Austin was saying, something General Sir Mike Jackson has been emphasizing today, making very sure that they move in as rapidly as possible behind the retreating Serbs to prevent a power vacuum developing and the KLA, ethnic Albanians, exploiting that.
And very briefly,
controlled the airport since their unexpected dash to Pristina ahead of NATO. And although KFOR says it does not need the airfield, the Foreign Secretary made clear in the Commons he did not want any further surprises.
Confidence NATO and Russia eventually will work out an agreement that will allow 2,000 Russian troops to participate in NATO-led peacekeeping operations in Kosovo.
I want to stress
Russia's refusal to serve under a unified NATO command. But there's an immediate U.S. concern that no more Russian troops join the approximately 200 already at the Pristina airport. We do not say whether they've received any such assurance. And some U.S. intelligence analysts are worried. They've detected, quote, worrying signs that additional Russian troops could quickly be airlifted into Kosovo. Publicly, the administration plays down these
convoys as troops and their families head north. But it looks as though the withdrawal will fail to meet the Tuesday deadline for Yugoslav forces to be out of the southernmost zone, which includes the capital, Pristina.
One formula under consideration, sources say, is to have Russian troops participate in a NATO-led peacekeeping force, but to report to a non-NATO general, perhaps someone from Finland, who in turn would report to the NATO commander, Lieutenant General Sir Mike Jackson. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is insisting that progress is being achieved, and she's upbeat that an eventual agreement will be achieved.
Petrol station forecourts, on street corners, and the men of the Parachute Regiment putting Northern Ireland patrolling to use among Serbs and Albanians. A town where vengeance has been wreaked as many of the Serbs depart, leaving the British to deal with the aftermath. Calm people down, that's the message to the men threading their way through the people here.
because many of the people in this city will be very scared of soldiers. Many of them will be very scared about their future. It is vital that one para reassures them with professional patrolling so that they know that they are secure and they know that their future is safe.
The British are thundering around to the outlying villages, covering every dot on the map. In Serb areas, there is insurgencies. Those with collective responsibility for these deeds were this morning still in town. A Serb army, grumpy and jumpy, complying ever so slowly with NATO's demand that they leave. They're none too happy to be seen in their present situation. And late this afternoon, hundreds more Serb soldiers were rolling up to go. Men posing, gesturing, yelling abuse at NATO. Past them went the Green Howards from the Irish Guards battle group to the Serb Shagra, heading for the suburb which bears the name treasured in Serb history, Kosovo Polje, in honor of the battle all Serbs glory in 600 years ago.
An American armored column finally rolled into eastern Kosovo today, spearheaded by U.S. Marines with Cobra gunship air cover. The welcome in the first village they came to was a mini version of the Allies arriving in Paris in 1944. Chanting NATO, NATO, villagers who had been in hiding for nearly 3 months showered the Marines with flowers.
Elderly women blowing us kisses and things like that.
You see this day?
Make you want to stay in the Marine Corps for 40 years.
We always plan for the worst, but hope for the best, and fortunately, so far, it's been the best.
But they didn't know how close they might have come to the worst. A few minutes after the Marines passed here, British troops were shown what they said was a landmine booby trap in a house. The Albanian owners, who had just come back from 3 months of hiding in the woods, said their house had been occupied by Yugoslav forces. And fear of them lingers on. When Yugoslav armor rolled through on its way home, people instinctively stepped back. But when the Marines were around, Yugoslav troops got a different reception. It's the kind of thing that could pose serious problems for the U.S. forces if it provoked any reaction.
American and Yugoslav forces weren't supposed to meet like this. The plan was that the Yugoslav army would be out of here before the Americans arrived. But so far, it's only created traffic jam problems. As long as both sides act like professional armies, one American officer said, things should be okay.
At this junction, U.S. troops, Yugoslav, Serb refugees, and British forces snarled together. But with a bit of ingenuity and cooperation, it was sorted out. The Marines came in loaded for bear, but at least in the Albanian villages, the hands they met didn't hold guns. They just wanted to touch Americans. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Kosovo.
Reconnaissance camera shows the Serbs are trying hard to get out of Kosovo, but the 200 Russian soldiers who seized Pristina airport this weekend are not. NATO commander Michael Jackson had planned to set up his headquarters there, but now he says the Russians can have it.
I'm not in a turf war with them. They are on the airfield. They regard it as important. It is not important to me at this stage. What is important to me is getting this job done on the ground.
Moscow has promised not to send in any more troops, but several hundred paratroopers at bases in Russia are on alert, although so far the necessary countries have not granted overflight rights. Pentagon officials do expect a Russian convoy from Bosnia to bring in fresh supplies for the troops at the airport.
They are running out of supplies, and so I would anticipate that there will be some resupply efforts made in the next couple of days.
200 Russians are a drop in the rising tide of more than 14,000 NATO troops now in Kosovo. But their mere presence violates the most basic principle of the Kosovo force, known as KFOR.
Germany's first task was to extricate the Serb oppressors from the midst of the oppressed as they covered the Serb retreat from the town of Prizren. In return for the favor, German units later came under sniper fire and then direct attack from 2 Serb civilians. The firefight was short and to the point. One of the assailants killed on the spot, the other severely wounded. By morning, terrified Serb civilians were literally being run out of town by ethnic Albanians. Again, the Germans were thrown into the breach, providing protection for the backers of the losing side in this vicious war.
By mid-afternoon, the mood had changed, and Prizren had become the biggest party town in southern Kosovo.
With the coast finally clear, the Kosovars came down from the mountains and up from the cellars where they'd been hiding these many months. The intensity of the celebration in direct proportion to the pain and suffering past. How do you feel?
Oh, I'm feeling very, very good. This is like a dream.
As they danced around the NATO armor, it was a good day to be a man in German uniform, and even better to be wearing the colors of the KLA. But the rebel fighters are keeping a low profile on the outskirts until the situation settles. This was the...
We overtook mile after mile of Serbian armor, tanks, artillery, and more than 3,000 men. No sign here of an army in retreat. Three-fingered salutes of victory and jeers as we passed. They were traveling on the road that took the brunt of NATO's air attacks, unscathed and uncowed. But this time NATO was giving them free passage. It was difficult to coax out the story of the full horror of Pech, but eventually it came. Interrupted by the rumble of Serbian armor, watched by their paramilitaries, he told us of the rape of young girls in front of their parents, the stabbing of babies, the mass exodus of a whole community, the terror of never being able to leave your home for fear of losing your life. No celebrations here for NATO's arrival, the few Kosovars remaining still too frightened of their Serbian neighbors to leave their house.
Designated Zone 1, as you said, that zone does include this, the capital Pristina. NATO officials again saying that there's good progress on that front. On the other hand, the KLA appears to be moving in very swiftly into any of the areas that have been evacuated by Yugoslav forces, moving in a show of force, still holding their arms. As a point of clarification, I also talked with NATO officials this day, asking them, isn't the KLA supposed to hand in its arms? I was told that the KLA is supposed to demilitarize. That means get rid of its military structure. The handing in, the handover of arms is strictly voluntary, I was told. But it was noted that these kinds of scenes with kicking in doors could be seen as an intimidating act, and that was not to be tolerated. Still, because this is happening right under peacekeepers' noses, it is raising a lot of questions about how even-handed NATO is being, whether NATO is enforcing the agreement evenly on both sides. And it's really this entry of the KLA, this kind of behavior that is triggering the exodus of ethnic Serbs from this province. More than
by the parachute regiment in the northeast area of Pristina were approached by distraught relatives of the deceased, of a Serb male who'd been shot, and they continued their patrol in the area, came under fire from a house which they surrounded. They invited the occupants of the house to surrender, which very wisely they did, and 5 emerged with their hands held up and surrendered their weapons to the parachute regiment. Those 5 suspected KLA members are now held in KFOR British military custody.
Now, what does that mean, being
by defeat? Unbowed by their surrender or what's been done to the people of Kosovo, Serb troops still move among the population here, armed.
I love NATO, I love Serbia, I love Yugoslavia.
An awkward meeting between Serb soldiers and the British troops sent here to make sure they leave this city by the end of today. The people who remained in Arasovac don't yet sleep easy, almost a week after the peace deal was signed. The war stepped nearer today as these NATO troops supervised the end of the Serb withdrawal from the southern zone of Kosovo. Paul Welsh, BBC News, Arasovac, Kosovo.
A post in downtown Pristina, fashioned out of a school, Yugoslav troops made headway toward a withdrawal. Similar scenes were playing out across the southern part of the province, designated Zone 1. That zone includes Pristina. NATO officials say they see good progress in the withdrawal and expect Belgrade to be able to make the midnight Tuesday deadline called for in the agreement.
For NATO troops and supplies into the province. Now refugees and military logistics combining to slow down all the traffic that has to get through.
A cafe was looted and burnt out. Serbian soldiers are said to have drunk their fill and set the fire as they withdrew. A last farewell to the local ethnic Albanian population. But compared to Sunday's violence, the atmosphere in Prizren at the start of the week was calmer. The first day in Prizren began well for the German troops. As they entered the town, hundreds of people came out of hiding to greet them. It was an enthusiastic reception. But soon it became clear that the German soldiers had occupied one of the most difficult areas of this troubled province. Kosovo Albanians surrounded the headquarters of the Serbian forces to prevent their withdrawal. The Serbs fired over the heads of the crowd. The KFOR soldiers tried to keep the peace. It was a dangerous moment. For a while it looked as if the German soldiers themselves would be caught in the crossfire. When two men drove shooting at a German checkpoint, the soldiers took cover and returned fire. One of the attackers died in the shootout. One of the Germans was shot in the arm. The second attacker was treated by Bundeswehr paramedics, but later died of his injuries. It was the first action Bundeswehr troops had seen on the ground since the force was set up in 1955. For some soldiers, it's been a baptism of fire.
Schön cool bleiben, ruhig bleiben, okay? Cool bleiben.
But the real task is to see the Serbian paramilitaries and the Yugoslav army leave the city and the surrounding area. That's what the Yugoslav generals agreed with NATO. But in practice, the withdrawal is not going so smoothly.
In prison. You have to leave within 30 minutes, and it's 11 o'clock now. There's no moment, there's an order. That's the end of the discussion. You have now 28 minutes.
But most of the military is pulling out more or less peacefully. Following in their wake are Serbian civilians, fearing retribution from Kosovo Albanians. Once, Serbs made up 1/10 of the town's population. Now it seems hardly any of them will stay. The German soldiers are at pains to prevent revenge attacks on the Serbs. Their job is to remain strictly neutral towards both sides. That means towards the Kosovo Liberation Army as well. Witnesses in the province say KLA troops are returning to the towns, bringing their weapons. If the G8 peace agreement is to be fulfilled, they have to be disarmed. Even